Great. We have another, real all-star panel here, so I don't want us to lose a single moment that we can be hearing from them. So without further ado, I'd like to ask you to welcome Chris DeMuth, former president of AEI, and he will introduce his panel, and we'll get started right up. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. I'm going to sit here now. Okay. And then I'll walk over. Our first panel was on the background, how these procedures came to be in law and process on Capitol Hill and in the White House. The second panel is going to be delving into the problems, especially with the 1974 Act. And then the third it will be on solutions. But this is not just an academic seminar. We're not at a think tank. We're up here on Capitol Hill. We want to be results-oriented. And if there are individuals on this panel that have ideas about carving a way forward, they are not going to be prevented from the moderator from going into those matters. We have three distinguished academic economists who have served as head of the Congressional Budget Office, and an individual from the world of business and real active politics who has written a wonderful book on our fiscal problems today. And we will be going in the order first, chronologically, of our budget chiefs. We'll begin with Rudolph Penner, who is the R.J. and Francis Miller Chair at the Urban Institute. He was head of CBO in 1983 through 1987. He has served in senior positions at OMB, at the White House, and several executive agencies. He writes widely on tax policy, budget policy, debt, and deficits. My favorite of his recent works from last summer is When Budgeting Was Easier, Eisenhower and the 1960 Budget. Those were the days. Next, we will hear from Robert Reischauer. He's President Emeritus of the Urban Institute and was President of Urban from 2000 to 2012. He was head of the Budget Office from 1989 to 1995. And he writes widely, testifies before Congress frequently on health care, social welfare issues, and federal budget policy. He is one of the public trustees of the Social Security and Medicare trust funds. So young people who are in the audience, any of you who may be concerned about whether your payroll taxes will be there for you when the time comes, please see Mr. Reischauer afterwards. Give him your name and Social Security number, and he'll keep an eye on those matters for you. Next, June O'Neill is Woolman Distinguished Professor of Economics at Baruch College, City University of New York. She was head of the CBO 1995 to 1999. She's a longtime research associate of National Bureau of Economic Research and has done path-breaking empirical work on poverty, wage discrimination, income distribution, welfare, and Social Security policy. Bill White was Deputy Secretary of Energy in the Clinton administration. He's been primarily in business and finance and is now with Lazard. But he is, I think, best known in Texas for having served three sensational terms as mayor of Houston from 2004 to 2010. His last two elections he won by votes of over 91% and over 86%. His party then enlisted him for a mission impossible to run against a very popular incumbent Republican, Rick Perry. And that came out the way it was destined to. But in the course of that election, he won more votes for governor than any Democratic candidate in the history of the Lone Star State. After that, he decided to write a book. He was not happy. He could not find anybody who'd done a real history of the national debt that satisfied him, so he sat down and he did it himself. It was published earlier this year, America's Fiscal Constitution, Its Triumph and Collapse. I recommend it very highly. I'm going to turn to people in this order, and I'm going to ask especially our three CBO emeriti, what have turned out to be the major flaws in the 1974 Budget Act? Were those there at the start? Are the problems inside the Act? If we tweak the procedures here and there, could we get a better result? Or is it due to other changes in the wider political culture, such as Chairman Archer mentioned, growth of entitlements, the growth of partisanship in Washington? Can we just fix the Act, or do we have to fix other things along the way? What has their experience told them about the problems in the Act and the path forward to reform? Starting with Rudy Penner, please.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. I think I'll talk about it a little broader than just the context of the 1974 Act, because I think the really big challenge before us, and really the only big budget problem, is the matter of controlling Social Security and health costs. Both are rising very rapidly because the baby boomers are aging and applying for benefits. Historically, health programs have been afflicted by rising costs per beneficiary as well, although that's abated some. Most expect it to reaccelerate in the future. And, you know, just as recently as 1990, Social Security and the major health programs accounted for about 37% of non-interest spending. Now they're up to 50%. And the problem is that these programs are extraordinarily popular politically. It's just very difficult to attack them. And many point to the rise of extreme partisanship as making life more difficult for budgeteers. But I think those programs would be very difficult to reform even if there was much less partisanship going. And I'm not really even sure that partisanship per se is the problem. After all, if you look at Ronald Reagan or Tip O'Neill or Bob Dole, they were extremely partisan people. But they collaborated, they reached deals. And I think the really bigger change now is the lack of willingness to make deals, or maybe the lack of skill to make deals. Now, Social Security, and now I finally get to the process itself, Social Security and Medicare aren't only extremely popular politically, but as entitlements, they are favored by the uneven playing field that we have between entitlements and discretionary spending. If Congress does nothing to an entitlement, it just goes on. The law usually defines the benefits to which people are entitled. It defines an eligible population, and then we just pay for everybody who shows up. We've tried to control Medicare with a price control system that would make the Soviet Union proud, but it hasn't been very successful, to say the least. Now, meanwhile, discretionary programs, defense, national parks, medical research, host of other programs through which the general public really gets to know government, those things have to fight almost annually for appropriations. And moreover, partly to counter the extreme budget pressures that come from the growth of Social Security and the health programs, we have imposed caps on discretionary programs. And that's there's such a diversity of them, that's rather easy to do because you can impose a cap and seem fiscally responsible without saying exactly what you're going to cut. And you leave that up to the poor appropriators, but they have an out too. So when they do cut something, and this is maybe a good aspect of caps, they can say the caps made me do it. But I think that the most important thing that we could do in the budget process is to make entitlements look more like discretionary spending. Bob and I were in a group several years ago that suggested they be capped, but I think that was an unfortunate choice of language. I don't really think it's practical to actually cap them, but there should be targets for that spending, and we should have mechanisms that help us achieve those targets. And I guess when one talks about mechanisms, one is getting into the turf of the next panel, and I've talked too long probably, but the kind of tools that have been put out there for Medicare, for example, you have the premium support ideas of Chairman Ryan, you have President Obama's IPAB, if it ever does exist, we're not so sure about that. I like to think about various trigger mechanisms that would automatically change the parameters of programs if they exceeded the target. Very difficult to design a trigger that the Congress just won't willy-nilly overturn if it gets painful. But I think it can be done. I think we should give a lot of thought to that. So we might discuss these sort of things later, and I'm sure the next panel will. So thank you.
Thank you, Rudy. Bob Reischauer.
Clearly the budget process isn't working well, and the question is, why is that so? And there's really three possibilities, and probably all of them contribute to this. The first is that the process is flawed in some way, needs to be reconfigured and strengthened, and there's lots of ideas out there, having to do with making the budget committees leadership committees, to making the budget resolution a joint resolution, meaning it would have to be signed by the president as opposed to a concurrent resolution, which is only an action of Congress, line item vetoes, 20-year perspectives. You've heard some of those. My guess is that all of those would make a rather small difference in the success of the budget process. The second possibility is our larger institutions of governance are broken, or at least they're ill-suited to the challenges that we now face. We have a Senate which can be brought to a halt through filibusters. We have very little in the way of party discipline or accountability, and so you have situations in which chairmen of committees can flout the leadership and yet remain in charge of committees, and so there's little cohesion even within parties, let alone across parties. It's possible that in our current structure, the balance of power between Congress and the executive branch is too even, so either side can just refuse to play ball. The third possibility is the public's view on the size and the role of government are too split. I mean, that we're a divided nation, and people have very strongly and polarized views of what is right, and therefore we get what the people want, which is no action at all because they can't agree, and until a broader consensus develops within the body politic, we shouldn't expect either the Congress to work well or the budget process within the Congress to work well. We need to remember that this is a rather unusual set of circumstances that we're in right now because, is this not working?
Yeah, let me just switch with you. Thank you.
Now, I can tell you what I really think. We're in a rather unusual situation because, as Rudy says, looking out over the long run, we have some rather significant fiscal adjustments to make in a contractionary way, or we have to increase the tax burden, which most Americans have become used to. We faced this in the Clinton administration and through a set of very unusual circumstances, which was the longest economic expansion in American history, and a time when the evil empire was falling apart, and therefore we could reduce very significantly something that accounted for close to half of our budget, namely defense, without huge arguments one way or another. We were able to get out of that fiscal situation we were in. But now, when we have demographics driving the problem for the future, it's a very different situation. And our political system is not designed to endure short-run pain for long-run benefits. We are very myopic. We operate on 2-year cycles of utility maximization in the political sense, and don't have a lot of experience in our history for doing this successfully. I just point out one thing that changed from the time that CBO was first established that changed things, and that was the indexation of the tax system. We had a tax system which generated increasing amounts of revenue, some due to economic growth, some due to inflation. We took away, when we indexed the tax system, the income tax system, that inflation-related one. So no longer is the Congress sort of having to say, boy, we have a lot of money. What are we going to do with this, quote, fiscal dividend? We have just the opposite challenge before us. And we don't know if our system can handle that.
Thank you very much. Judy.
I have a prop. When I first came to CBO and we had the passing of the torch, Bob presented me with this lovely animal. It's a little skunk. And he said, you have to remember that the role of CBO is to be the skunk in the garden party. And actually, as I've thought about it, that I think is an important role of CBO. The cost estimates matter. I was at CBO for a couple of years, shortly after the '74 Act, when CBO was smaller, and I was in charge of the health, education, and welfare in budget analysis. That's the group that actually does the cost estimates. Those cost estimates over the years have become more and more important. When I first arrived, the budget committee people sort of they wanted to ignore the CBO estimates because they felt that they'd always used the agency estimates, and who could do better than the agencies doing their own estimates. And so it took a bit before the CBO estimates were actually seriously regarded. I think that then as director, I could see that they played a huge role. Members and the people the staffers at the budget committees were obviously very interested in cost estimates, and cost estimates were used often to sort of break or make a piece of legislation. So they are very important, and I think that over the years CBO has been, basically nonpartisan and did try and do the most honest and best estimates that you can do. Now, of course, estimates are estimates, and in thinking about the process generally, budget policy is just one of the things that actually affects the budget outcome, because I try to classify the various kinds of forces that are actually affecting what happens, and one is GDP growth. We know what's happening this year, or we hope we know. Sometimes they're revised. But what's going to happen in the future is another matter. It's very difficult to foretell the future. But inflation, the level of interest rates, the distribution of income, as Bob mentioned, the indexation of income and eliminating inflation as a reason for tax growth was an important development. But of course, inflation is low now, so it's not a serious issue, but we don't adjust for increases in real income adjusted for inflation. And when income increases, and especially if it increases at the top, it's going to bring in a lot more revenues. Now, during the period during which I was the director, we were always behind the curve. We never could, we always underestimated. During the 80s was a period of rosy scenarios, and that has a bad effect on the estimates, because you're assuming that things are going to be a lot better than they really are, so you can spend more. And if that doesn't happen, then you start accumulating deficits. But during the 90s, and it's sort of, Newt Gingrich was the speaker, and he was very engrossed with budget estimates, and he believed that, as it turned out correctly, that CBO was underestimating the extent to which the economy was really going to grow. Now, we were not alone. The CBO estimate never stuck out there as being the most underestimating outfit. We were always quite close to the professional forecasters, the people in the blue chip community. We were never really very far from the administration estimates, but we did underestimate growth. So maybe that was a good thing, because there was probably more restraint, undoubtedly more restraint than would otherwise be the case. But there are also other things that happen that you can't predict. The ending, as Bob mentioned, the ending of the Cold War really allowed the defense budget to be sharply cut, and did a lot for budget stability at that time. But there are other kinds of things besides wars. Then there are wars which you didn't know about in advance, which do the opposite. They incur more spending. Oil shocks, saving and loan crisis, events that happen in the world. There were the Asian capital flight disaster that didn't last that long, but for the time being, it looked like it was going to be something very important. In doing the budget forecast that everybody gets fixated on as though it is true, it's impossible for it to be. It would be a rare time if it came out exactly there's always a gap between what is forecast. And if you go out more years, projecting over a 10-year period is obviously going to be more inexact than projecting over a 1-year period. But so there's always, just in the mechanisms that we use and rely on, there's going to be, you can never really be quite sure. And now that the world has become so much more complex, the numbers of things that might happen that you don't know about when you're actually doing the projections and estimates, seem to be multiplying. Of the various changes in policy, it's hard to think of something that could change that would be really do the trick. And looking over the various things that were tried, the era when there were budget caps, I look back and I thought, well, they did do a little something, but they're never going to be key, because what's a cap in one period can be uncapped in another. So, but I would say not to neglect the power of the cost estimates for the bills that are coming up to be voted on. It's very important that they be done impartially, as I believe most of the time they are, and that they in themselves are really an important part of the entire of budget policy. I think that's what I want to well, there's much more that can be said, but I
Let,
will.
let me just add a little bit of color commentary to the skunk here, and this goes back to a period where CBO, under my leadership, did something that upset the Clinton administration greatly, and the Washington Post published a editorial called "A Skunk at the Garden Party," which was praising CBO for being objective and calling it like it was. And the editorial board gave me a mechanical skunk that looked like this, but it was mechanized, had a battery in it,
A bit
and you
more.
turned it on, and it went forward, about 5 paces, and then its tail shot up like this, and the tail had written on it CBO, and it went back like that. This Skunk at the Garden Party editorial, or a version of it, has been done 2 or 3 times by the Washington Post. I also got a little handwritten certificate from Meg Greenfield, who was the chair of the editorial board at the Washington Post and a legend in this city, which had, in Latin, she was a Latin scholar, had the name for a skunk, but the skunk turns out to be a New World animal, which I didn't know, and so Meg had to make it up. Create a new Latin word, because obviously the Latin language had faded long before the skunk came into existence in Western European literature. So I have this thing. It's unfortunately now broken. Various grandchildren and others have played with it because a magazine that was doing a story about CBO heard about it and came out to my house with with photographers to take a picture of it. I couldn't get it to work.
Actually, looking back, I think that one reason I might have been chosen at the time was because I had written an article doing an estimate of the employment effects of Hillary Care, same legislation, which found that some 300,000, 400,000 additional people would be unemployed as a result of the legislation. So, which would have been a plus to being proud, obviously.
Bill White, you have looked at these fiscal and budgetary problems over a longer period of history than just the past 30 years, going back to beyond Coolidge all the way to Andrew Jackson and back to the founders. And I wonder what you can tell us from the broad sweep that you have studied and written about how these debates of the past decade fit in. Are they? Can you pin the problems on the '74 Act or other things that were happening back then, or are there larger problems afoot?
Well, Chris and distinguished panel members, it helps to start with a definition of the problem, and everybody may have their own definition, but I'll venture mine. We have broken or severed the link between tax policy and spending policy. Okay, now there's subsets of this and consequences of that, but one consequence is that today the total federal debt that must be serviced by federal funds revenues is 9 times greater than the federal funds revenues available to service debt. That's a bad ratio, and not an easy ratio to find, by the way, in the government's books, even though if you're a private equity firm or a bank, that's the ratio you would look at to determine the relative burden of debt. Last time that happened for several years was in the 1790s, and we've compounded interest for 13 years, and I think everybody, if you're at this meeting, you probably know what the consequences of that are for debt service over the next 10 years. So that's an issue, the severance of that. Throughout most of American history, the federal government of the United States managed to link tax and spending policy so that for over 180 years, we only borrowed for 4 well-defined purposes: to wage war, to acquire territory or connect territories, such as Panama Canal, Union Pacific Railroad, to prevent states from leaving the nation, and to offset the loss of revenues and provide some relief during downturns. Those were the only four. That's a categorical statement. You get the book and you can see that it works. We did so for many years despite not having a formal presidential budget or congressional budget, but that doesn't mean there was not budgeting. Indeed, there was. And from the Jefferson administration, there were four basic budget practices, Chris, that were followed. Budgets that had clear accounting, that would, in Jefferson's word, be clear enough that they could be understood, the income statement, balance sheet, by the ordinary merchant, by most business people. We had pay-as-you-go budget planning, so except for these well-defined emergency purposes, the budgets would start with an estimate of revenues, and then you would allocate spending among the various categories of revenues. And amity during the Coolidge administration, debt reduction was a line item in the budget, and a surplus was not treated as a surplus unless it was over and above the budgeted debt reduction. So you'd take your revenues, allocate it but start with a revenue estimate. You had trust funds, which confined spending to the amount of dedicated revenues in those trust funds. That began back in the Jefferson administration and continued as a model of trust funds up until general revenues were used for Medicare. And finally, you had explicit congressional authorization for the amount and purpose for each debt that was incurred. And even after we had the Second Liberty Bond Act, and we had a debt ceiling, overall debt ceiling in 1917, by up until, say, sometime in the early 1970s, you could pretty much list, without listing, using all your fingers, the purposes and amounts for which the accumulated debt had been incurred. And most people could do that who were knowledgeable about the budget. So I won't tell you the story. Read the book about how each of those pillars of the American fiscal tradition or fiscal constitution collapsed or eroded over time. But I will jump and say, so what do we learn from that? What do we learn from these practices that tended to, it was not that, believe me, it was not that, Americans used to care more about the future of their kids than they do today. I don't see that. It was not that they had a better understanding of macroeconomics than they do today. That's not the case. It was not that people woke up at the end of 2000, decided they liked debt, and that they were mistaken as celebrating a surplus the year before. It was some of these things that led to greater accountability. So here are three, the type of lessons that you might learn from that. And as I'm mentioning these potential reforms, there may be others along these lines. Let me say, if they sound a bit strange, that they were consistent with some federal practices throughout much of American history, and moreover, they explicitly conform to the standard practices used by state and local governments throughout the United States of America. So let me just say, these are not radical. First, suppose that we had a budget that was a revenue-funded budget and broke your budget into a revenue-funded budget by appropriation category, including permanent appropriations, and debt-funded budget. If you did that, there wouldn't be this nonsense that contributes to the political theater of people claiming that we're going to default on our debts if we don't raise the debt ceiling, or the debt ceiling theater itself, that one of the items that ought to be funded in a cash-funded budget as a priority matter would be interest on the debt, and there may be other priorities. But then that would feed into the second point. Suppose you had a budget process where you voted on a revenue-funded appropriations for each of your 13 appropriations bills, plus You'd have to work out how to do it on permanent appropriations so that you could have a record vote, a revenue-funded portion, and a debt-funded portion, separate votes. So somebody would not be if they voted against an ag bill. If they voted against an ag bill, it didn't mean they were against all agricultural programs. I mean, you could vote for the part of the agricultural appropriations that was funded with tax revenue, but vote against that portion, which was funded by debt, and explain that to constituents. And you would be able to have a scorecard as to what debt was used for and who voted to incur debt and who did not. And then the final is less process and policy oriented, but it is a sort of policy framework without a predefined end goals. And in my view, and that includes some discussion with members, I think there is a nucleus of members who may embrace this in both parties, perhaps more Republicans than Democrats, and I think it ought to be bipartisan, is the goal of pay-as-you-go Medicare. As you know, up until 1970, Medicare did have a portion of general funded revenues that made it much more difficult to have standalone accountability within the trust funds. But then after 2000, the general funds have funded, well, not general funds, that's a euphemism, that's a debt has funded the growth of the increased contribution from non-trust fund sources of the Medicare spending. There isn't any other, logical way to express it, in my view. Who possibly can believe that using debt to fund Medicare is a good idea? Certainly is not a way to sustain the program. Certainly disguising the cost of the program is not a good way to invite a realistic discussion of means to contain the cost of the program. And if you want to contain medical costs, which people in both parties do, pay the same or less for the same amount of service, then it makes no sense to add onto the annual federal medical bill interest from last year's medical bills in the years before and to continue to compound that interest. So with that, I have a couple of other comments, but Chris, I've reached my time and turn the mic back over to you.
Thank you, Your Honor. Rudy suggested that we really don't have a budget problem. We have an entitlements problem, these very popular programs. And I wonder if the other members of the panel agree with that. I learned earlier this morning that Congress has not actually passed a budget and regular appropriations for many years now. So certainly the budgeting process that was envisioned by the '74 Act is broken. But did the growth of entitlements break it? If we could wave a wand and have a financially sound retirement system and medical care system for the poor and elderly in America, would the budgeting problem be fixed? Would it be over? I want to get some other people. We heard Rudy. I want to see how far this argument goes.
The fact that Rudy's office and my office are right next to each other, we don't agree on everything.
Can you use that one? Yeah, thanks.
It is true that the greatest challenge going forward budgetarily is the projected growth of healthcare costs in Medicare and Medicaid. For the last few years, those two programs have been quite well behaved. In fact, per beneficiary Medicare spending has been flat in nominal terms for the last 3 years. But going forward, the projections suggest there's going to be a significant problem. This is a problem that isn't peculiar to Medicare or Medicaid. It's peculiar to the health sector of our economy. What we're doing in the government sector is no more sustainable than what's happening to private employers or individuals who are buying their own. It's something that we have to come to grips with as a nation. And so I don't consider that I consider that a national problem, not a budget problem. With respect to Social Security, just a little fact, and that is that if the program could be started anew, the folks who are, let's say about 30 or younger, are going to make contributions into the system that are about equal to the benefits they're going to take out. The nature of the problem is that our great-grandparents, our grandparents, and our parents are getting out much, much more than they put in plus the earnings on those. And so, this is, if one were arguing equity, an argument that not payroll taxes, but general revenue should be used to support those generous benefits. And we gave those generous benefits for a very good reason, and that was we didn't want our parents-in-law living with us. These were generations that fought World War II, that went through the Depression, and we said we're a rich enough nation to pick that up, but we didn't fulfill the promise by raising our taxes to cover that. We just sort of handed it on continuously to the next generation. Were there no baby boom, were the demographics level, this would have been an appropriate strategy forever. But we have fluctuations in fertility rates.
Actually, one thing, though, is that the elderly are no longer the poorest part of the population. They've become much richer. I happen to have a graduate student who's doing her dissertation on the income and well-being of the elderly. And in terms of assets, the older population, even 75 and older, you now have much more assets than they ever had before, and compared to the rest of the population. So I think that there's some rethinking to be done about what we owe the elderly. I think it may be the opposite way around, that the elderly will be taking in their children because they're doing much better. I don't know how much longer that will continue, but I did want to say something about appropriations. The sort of bread and butter, it's a smaller part of the, it has been, a smaller part of the budget. Entitlements have been growing. But nonetheless, the feuding that goes on over appropriations is much more dramatic. If one was going to write an opera, it would be about what goes on with the appropriated programs. I can recall, for example, the farming sector. Although agriculture is no longer the king of the economy, it nonetheless generates a tremendous amount of political involvement because of the subsidies, the price supports, and so on. And anytime there's been a bill where it looks like there's going to be a problem, farmers come with their harvesting machines and threshers, clutter up all of the capital so that no traffic can go by. And finally, the members will relent and make not. But that's true. Highway construction, all kinds of things engage many more people, so it becomes much more of a struggle. It would be very hard. You're always stepping on some important group's toes when you try to rein in expenditures. During the 90s, I think, with the Contract for America, there was some reining in, but it went by the board, and once the surplus came about, there was no stopping it. So I wouldn't discount the part of the budget that's appropriated.
Chris, I'd just say, start here. People talk about what the problem of the budget, and there's two types of diagnosis. One is when people are thinking, well, Congress isn't doing what I would do if I were dictator, or the hubris type of critique. And the other is that there's a broad consensus that we're not getting the type of result that we want. There's a broad consensus on that. And on that, this issue of matching federal commitments and resources is central. And on that, I do not think you can address the issue of, well, like last year we had 30%, almost 30% of the federal funds budget was borrowed, despite the fact we had record high national income and relatively small, spending for combat. So that's a problem. I don't think you can address that without addressing Medicare and Medicaid. Sometimes I think Rudy are with a broad brush in saying entitlements, but I think that the federal medical expenditures, as each person here knows, it would require fairly modest changes within the Social Security program in the overall scheme of things to put it in actuarial balance. Certainly much more modest changes than to put the federal funds budget into a long-term balance because of the rising medical expenditures.
Could I
Go ahead. Yeah.
get back to Bob's point? Certainly agree. The health sector, public and private, has a huge cost problem, especially if the projections that costs will again accelerate are right. But I do clearly think it is a budget problem because the public sector is responsible for a large part of the health sector. And to the extent it is, the incentives that govern the decisions, the policy decisions involving Medicare and Medicaid, are very different than the incentives, say, facing an employer who's trying to rein in the costs of their health programs. And it's those different political incentives where people are making the decisions and trying to remain popular and trying to get a majority vote that really makes it a budget problem, in my view, and a budget problem that we have to get a handle on.
There's been some talk this morning, beginning with Amity's introduction, about the respective roles of the executive and the legislature. And certainly the 74 Act marked a huge shift toward the Congress. Congress thought it was going to be exerting greater control, but it certainly disabled the president from exerting as much control as he had in the past through impoundments, through this subtle redefinition of the meaning of the term appropriation. I have two questions for our panelists. The first is, has there been some success in the Congressional Budget Office itself? It used to be that there was only one game in town, OMB, and now we have essentially two budget offices. And it appears to me that especially in the long-term forecasts that come out several different parameters several times per year, it seems to me that CBO has essentially displaced OMB as the prestige, authoritative budget center in Washington. Has that been a good thing? I mean, I like competition. The CBO reports are enormously useful. On the other hand, if the president is the only person that we have hope for to impose some discipline on this process, as other people have said, maybe some authority and prestige ought to be given back to the other part of the folks downtown.
No. Ask yourself what the role of OMB and the Council of Economic Advisors is. They're embedded within the executive branch. They should be producing numbers and estimates that show the president's policies in the best possible light while remaining credible. They did that on the whole before the Reagan administration with Rosie's scenario and the clear bias that was introduced by other presidents as well after that. They lost their credibility. To Congress's benefit, I think, it has not interfered with the Congressional Budget Office in its economic forecast or its cost estimates. It causes a lot of angst and upset when this happens, and there's a lot of complaining that goes on. If you're a CBO director, you have to have the hide of a rhinoceros, and be bad at hearing because you get, screams and calls of anguish from members whose legislation has not been costed out as cheaply as they had hoped, or the benefits have not been as great as they have hoped. So we have an institution that has been nonpartisan, objective, and high quality, producing these estimates. There's an open competition when the administration, if the administration chose to go a different route, they will regain the authority.
Well, and yeah. Okay. And I think that the CBO has pushed them into changing the nature of their forecasts. I do believe that rosy scenarios were much more prevalent before there was this competition. And I guess patting ourselves on the back, I think CBO won the competition by becoming more credible as far as the press was concerned in their forecast, even though, as June has admitted, they're often very, very wrong. So I think the administration forecasts, if not their budgets, their forecasts have become much more credible. Having said all that, I do think the pendulum has swung too far away from the president. I think the president deserves more of a role in the budget process than he gets. As you implied, he's the one person in this game that's elected by all the people. I don't have many good ideas for pushing the pendulum back. There are some very minor things you can do. One of the most minor is to have what's often called enhanced rescission. Now the president can ask for cancellation of budget authority unless that is explicitly approved by the Congress, I think in 45 days. It has to go away. I think at least you could make the Congress vote on that. So they would have to say, here are these things that the president deems wasteful. We don't agree that they're wasteful, and make that statement very explicit. And I think that would give the president a lot more bargaining power in the process, even though the rescissions themselves may be quantitatively relatively unimportant. But I admit that's not going to change the degree to which the pendulum has swung away from the president in budget process.
Well, a couple of things about CBO, the press has, I think, become much better educated, and many reporters comment about the forecasts all the time. But CBO makes it easier for them, and because with its website, CBO results are very transparent. Anyone can look at a cost estimate and see if they think the steps, if they would have the mindset to do it, are what they would agree with or correctly done or whatever. So that that's given, I think, CBO, a lot of credibility with the public, because the public reads what the press says, and the press tends to, I think, agree with CBO most of the time with what CBO is doing and promote them.
We're gonna go to questions, but I want to make a comment about a reaction to June and Bill's presentation. Her initial presentation focused on musical mics. Focused on the debates that CBO has been involved in long-term projections. One of the things that we've heard consistently this morning is that the members of the Congress don't do long-term. It cannot be done. It's inherent in the electoral structure and the Constitution. We want our representatives to be short-term oriented. At least we have a Constitution that guarantees that they are that way. And one of the things that CBO has done is to try to insinuate long-term thinking, to have right as part of Congress this authoritative voice about what the future looks like 10 and 25 years out. And I think the idea was that that should make congressional decision-making more responsible. We should think about the long-term future. But as June tells the story, everybody wants to change that future because suddenly the future is the source of resources that we can use today. So as I listen to you tell this story, I'm not so sure it's a good idea to get representatives thinking about the future because it's kind of this gold pot out there, and we can use more of it today. I'm struck after June, we had Bill, and he talks about the traditions that we had in the culture, and it was not thinking about the future. It was thinking about today. There were set rules. They were part of the culture. It wasn't the platform of one party or another. And Bill's proposals don't have anything to do with the long term. He wants to have more budgeting that reconnects current taxations with current expenditures. That's actually not trying to get Congress to think about the long term. It's saying, okay, Congress, these are short-term, immediate guys. You got taxes, you got spending, you figure it out, but do it all in the immediate term. And the various proposals that he had were a little bit different from the ethos of the 74 Budget Act, which was we're going to do some long-term thinking. I love the work that the CBO puts out. I read its work avidly, and it may have had some benefits. But it interests me that Bill, having studied this matter as it's portrayed over the centuries, is actually thinking of mechanisms that reduce decisions right down to the here and now. So those are the moderator's few thoughts. We're going to look around and see if there are questions, maybe just one or two. We are at our time limit. If people, I'm going to call, I see a hand up here, please wait for the mic and identify yourself briefly and ask a brief question.
Romina Boccia with the Heritage Foundation. This question is for Bill White. I was intrigued by your idea of the cash-funded budget and the debt-funded budget, and I wanted to see how you thought we should deal with Social Security, where over 30 years or so, the trust fund accumulated large assets, but now a large amount of the actual spending that goes out to pay benefits, $70 billion last year, comes from borrowing because the payroll tax no longer covers the outflow on a year-to-year basis. So where would that fall in the cash-funded versus debt-funded discussion?
Well, I think the budget should be make clear what would be in the federal funds budget versus the trust funds budget. So currently there is, there was some, how this gets off on a bit of a tangent, but I mean, there was some benefits, or there was some goodwill in 1969 when we had a unified budget of people wanting to look at the same national income accounts numbers that the economists were looking at. But I think people forgot that part of the reason for doing the budget the way we did and having a separate, essentially, trust funds budget. That, you know, I'm giving you a technical answer, but you ask a technical question. So that, I think it could be done. And incidentally, that's how it would be done, consistent with state and local government, so it's nothing very radical on that.
This panel is adjourned. We're going to turn to panel number 3. I would like to thank June O'Neill, Rudy Penner, Bob Reischauer, and Bill White for their very deep and penetrating presentations. Thank you.